John Kennedy destroys. Trevor Noah, you won't believe what he said. The studio lights glowed with that perfect warmth, the kind that makes everyone feel like they're part of something special, something alive. The audience was packed tight, their energy buzzing through the air, a mix of anticipation and excitement that only a live taping could summon. Trevor Noah's show was in full swing, the familiar rhythm of laughter and applause rolling through the room like a well-timed tide. Tonight's guest was John Kennedy, the respected senator from Louisiana, a man known for his sharp wit and folksy charm, the kind of figure who could command a room without trying too hard. He stepped onto the stage in a crisp navy suit, his tie just loose enough to hint at ease, his gray hair catching the light as he waved to the crowd. His expression was warm, but guarded, a half-smile playing on his lips, the kind of look that suggested he was ready for the cameras, but maybe thinking 3 steps ahead. Trevor greeted him with that signature grin, a blend of charm and just a touch of mischief, the kind that could disarm even the most stoic guest. The crowd clapped. Some cheered, a few chuckles rippled through as Trevor tossed out his opening line, something about Louisiana's heat and Kennedy's cool demeanor. It landed perfectly, the audience eating it up, and for a moment, everything was exactly as it should be. 2 professionals at the top of their game meeting in the glow of late-night television where the world felt light and the jokes came easy. They settled into the plush chairs, the desk between them a familiar barrier, a stage prop that made the conversation feel both intimate and performative. Trevor leaned forward, his hands animated as he dove into the banter, asking about Kennedy's latest projects, his work in the Senate, the kind of safe, crowd-pleasing topics that set the tone. Kennedy answered with ease, his drawl smooth and deliberate, peppering his responses with that southern cadence that made every sentence sound like a story. The audience laughed at his quips, nodded at his insights, and Trevor fed off their energy, steering the conversation with the skill of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. It was all going smoothly, the kind of night where the producers in the shadows could relax, knowing the show was hitting all the right beats. Then, about 10 minutes in, after the opening pleasantries had warmed the room and the conversation started to dig a little deeper, Trevor leaned back, his smile still bright but curious. "So, John," he said, his voice light, almost playful, "where exactly were you born? I mean, I hear that Louisiana accent, but I'm curious about the roots, you know." It was the kind of question Trevor had asked dozens of guests before, a soft pitch meant to open the door to a funny anecdote, maybe a story about a small-town childhood or a quirky family memory. The audience leaned in, expecting a laugh, maybe a charming tale about crawfish boils or bayou summers. But something shifted. Kennedy's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened like a door closing just enough to notice. His eyes, sharp and steady, flicked toward Trevor, and for a split second there was a pause that felt heavier than it should have. The crowd didn't notice at first, still caught in the rhythm of the show, but Trevor's instincts kicked in, his own smile faltering just a fraction. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the arms, and his voice came out low, steady, almost too calm. "That's not important," he said, the words flat, like they'd been dropped on the desk between them. The audience stirred, a few chuckles escaping, as if they thought it was the setup for a joke. Trevor blinked his head, tilting slightly, still holding on to the moment, trying to keep it light. "Not important," he said, his laugh soft, but probing. "Come on, man. I just like knowing where people come from. It adds context, you know." He gestured toward the crowd, inviting them into the moment, expecting Kennedy to play along, to toss back something clever or deflect with humor. But Kennedy didn't bite. Instead, he shrugged, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to carry more weight than it should. "Well," he said, his voice still calm, but now edged with something sharper. "I know where you come from, Trevor, and honestly, I don't think you belong here." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the studio. The audience went quiet, not out of shock yet, but confusion, as if they were waiting for the punchline that never came. Trevor's smile froze his eyes, narrowing not in anger, but in disbelief, like he was trying to replay the words in his head to make sure he'd heard them right. The air in the room shifted, the warmth of the lights suddenly feeling too bright, too exposing. "Sorry," Trevor said, his voice still steady, his hands now resting on the desk, fingers interlaced. "What did you just say?" It wasn't a challenge, not yet, but a clarification, a lifeline thrown to Kennedy to pull the moment back from whatever edge it was teetering on. Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on Trevor, and repeated himself, each word clear and deliberate. "I said, go back to your country." No smirk, no wink, no hint of irony to soften the blow. Just the words, raw and heavy, sitting in the space between them like a challenge. The audience held its breath, the silence so thick it seemed to swallow the sound of the camera's humming. A few people shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap or gasp, still clinging to the hope that this was some elaborate bit. Trevor's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He glanced to his left just for a moment toward the shadows where his producers stood, their faces unreadable in the dim light. Then he looked back at Kennedy, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and restraint. "You really want to do this? Here?" he asked, his voice low, not angry, but pointed, like he was giving Kennedy one last chance to back away. The senator didn't move, his face still calm, almost unreadable. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a hint of something, maybe defiance, maybe uncertainty that suggested he hadn't fully planned for this moment. "You heard me?" Kennedy said, his tone steady, but now carrying a trace of insistence. "You're good at what you do, Trevor, no question. But this isn't your place. You weren't born here. This isn't home for you." The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. They cut through the room with a precision that made the silence feel louder. Trevor sat back, his hands clenching just slightly in his lap, his posture stiffening as he processed what had just happened. The audience was no longer waiting for a joke. Phones were out now, red lights blinking from the crowd as people started recording, sensing that something real, something raw, was unfolding. Trevor took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on Kennedy, and for a moment, the studio felt like it was holding its collective breath. "You're talking about Africa, right?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a new weight, a quiet challenge that forced Kennedy to hear his own words reflected back. "That's what you mean? That because I was born in South Africa, I don't belong here?" He wasn't shouting, wasn't performing for the crowd, but there was a blade in his tone, now sharp and controlled. Kennedy didn't nod, didn't deny it. He just sat there, his hands still resting on the chair, his face carved in that same calm stillness that made him such a commanding figure in public life. But this wasn't a Senate hearing or a campaign speech. This was live television, and the weight of his words was sinking into the room like a storm cloud. Trevor leaned forward, his hands now flat on the desk, his voice dropping even lower, each word measured. "What are you allowing yourself to say to me right now?" he asked, not rhetorical, but direct. His eyes locked on Kennedy's, searching for something intent, regret, anything that would explain this. The audience was silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for the world to crack open. Kennedy leaned forward just enough to close the gap between them, his voice taking on a gruff edge, not loud, but unyielding. "I can say what I think," he said. That's the beauty of this country. And if I think something, I'll say it. If it bothers you, maybe you're the one in the wrong place." The words hit like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were so deliberate, so devoid of hesitation. Trevor's jaw tensed, a muscle twitching near his temple, not from fear, but from the effort of holding himself together. He looked off to the side again just for a second, as if steadying himself against the urge to react with anything other than control. Then he turned back his eyes, meeting Kennedy's, and his voice came out quiet but firm, like a line drawn in the sand. "You need to leave," he said, not shouting, not pleading, just stating a fact. "You need to get up and walk out of here before I have to ask security to do it." The crowd gasped softly, a collective intake of breath, as if they'd just realized this wasn't a skit, wasn't a planned moment. This was real, and it was unraveling in front of them. Kennedy looked around, his eyes scanning the audience, the cameras, the lights, as if suddenly aware of how many people were watching, how many lenses were trained on him. For a moment, he didn't move his hands, still gripping the arms of the chair, his face unreadable. Then slowly he stood, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were playing a role he hadn't fully rehearsed. He didn't say another word, just turned and walked off the stage. His footsteps echoing in the quiet studio, the lights casting a long shadow behind him that seemed to stretch across the floor like a warning. Trevor didn't watch him go. He sat still, his eyes fixed on the note cards on his desk, his fingers pressing them together, knuckles white as the control room scrambled to cut to a commercial. The audience sat frozen, some still holding their phones, others whispering to their neighbors, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The warmth of the evening was gone, replaced by a tension that clung to the air like humidity. Trevor looked up just once, his eyes meeting the camera for a brief moment, and there was something in his gaze, something unsaid, something unresolved, that told everyone watching that this wasn't over. Not yet. The studio lights had dimmed. The cameras had stopped rolling, and the audience had filed out into the cool night air, but the weight of what had happened lingered like a storm that hadn't quite passed. By the time the clip of John Kennedy's words to Trevor Noah, "Go back to your country," hit the internet, it was already spreading like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with reactions, hashtags, and hot takes, each post dissecting the moment from a different angle. Some called Kennedy a hero for his unfiltered honesty, praising his willingness to say what others might only think. Others branded him insensitive, his words a painful echo of old prejudices that had no place in a modern studio. The video, barely 2 minutes long, looped endlessly online, racking up millions of views within hours. People shared screenshots of Trevor's stunned expression, Kennedy's calm defiance, the audience's uneasy silence. Opinion pieces popped up on news sites, some rushed and half-baked, others diving deep into what it all meant. Threads on X exploded with arguments, some defending Kennedy's right to speak his mind, others demanding accountability for what they saw as a xenophobic jab. Through it all, Trevor stayed silent, his social media accounts untouched, no cheeky quips or clarifying posts to feed the frenzy. He was back at the studio the next morning, earlier than usual, walking the quiet hallways with a coffee in hand, his face composed but distant, like someone carrying a thought too heavy for a single sentence. John Kennedy, meanwhile, was no stranger to public scrutiny. As a senator from Louisiana, he'd built a reputation on his plain-spoken style, his ability to cut through political noise with a folksy charm that resonated with people. But this was different. This wasn't a Senate floor debate or a campaign rally where his words could be framed as policy or principle. This was personal, raw, and caught on camera in a way that left no room for spin. Back in his hotel room, Kennedy sat at a small desk. His phone buzzing with notifications he didn't bother to check. The news alerts piled up, each headline sharper than the last. Senator Kennedy's shocking comment to Trevor. Noah late-night clash goes viral. Does Kennedy's remark reveal a deeper divide? He scrolled through a few, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing at the way his words had been sliced and diced into sound bites. He wasn't surprised by the reaction public life had taught him to expect the storm, but he hadn't anticipated how heavy it would feel. The senator was a man who prided himself on saying what he meant, on standing by his convictions, but something about the way the studio had gone silent, the way Trevor's eyes had locked onto his, stayed with him. It wasn't regret, not yet, but a nagging sense that he'd crossed a line he hadn't fully seen. By mid-morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. On X, a hashtag, Kennedy vs. Noah, trended worldwide, with users posting memes of Kennedy's calm exit from the stage, some overlaying his words with dramatic music, others cutting to Trevor's restrained response. One viral post read, "Kennedy just said what half the country thinks. Good for him." Another countered, "Telling Trevor Noah to go back is a low blow. Kennedy should know better." The comments sections were a battlefield, with strangers arguing over free speech identity and who gets to call a place home. News channels picked up the story, pundits weighing in with their usual mix of outrage and analysis. Some framed it as a clash of cultures, others as a misstep by a seasoned politician who should have known the weight of his words. A few even speculated it was staged, a publicity stunt to boost ratings, though anyone who'd been in that studio knew better. The silence had been too real, the tension too sharp. Kennedy's team issued a brief statement, carefully worded. Senator Kennedy spoke candidly in the moment. He values open dialogue and respects Trevor Noah's contributions. It was diplomatic, but did little to calm the storm. If anything, it fueled the fire, with critics calling it a non-apology, a dodge that avoided the heart of the issue. Kennedy wasn't one to shy away from a fight, but this felt different. He sat in a quiet corner of a D.C. diner, away from the cameras and the chaos, meeting with an old friend, a retired journalist named Clara, who'd known him since his early days in politics. Over coffee, she didn't mince words. "John," she said, her voice low but firm, "you're a good man, but you stepped in it this time. You didn't just talk to Trevor, you talked to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. You need to fix this, not for the headlines, but for you." Kennedy listened, his hands wrapped around his mug, his eyes fixed on the table. Clara wasn't scolding him. She was pushing him to see what he'd missed in the heat of the moment. He'd spoken from a place he hadn't fully examined, a mix of frustration and reflex that had spilled out under the studio lights. He didn't hate Trevor, far from it. He admired the man's quick wit, his ability to navigate tough conversations with a smile. But something had snapped, something he couldn't quite name, and now the world was picking it apart. Back at the studio, Trevor was moving through his day with the same focus he always brought, running through scripts, joking with his team, but there was a quiet undercurrent in his demeanor. His producers had urged him to address the incident, maybe post a statement or weave it into the next show's monologue, but he waved them off. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm but final. He wasn't dodging the issue, he was processing it. Trevor had spent his life navigating moments like this, moments where his identity, his accent, his story made people question his place. Growing up in South Africa, he'd heard worse, felt the sting of being an outsider in sharper ways. But this was different. This was John Kennedy, a man he'd respected, a senator whose work he'd followed, whose charm had always seemed genuine. The words had caught him off guard, not because they were new, but because they came from someone he hadn't expected to wield them. He replayed the moment in his head, the way Kennedy's voice had stayed so steady, so sure. It wasn't anger that lingered in Trevor's chest. It was disappointment, the kind that comes when someone you thought you understood shows you a side you didn't see coming. As the day wore on, the online noise grew louder. A popular talk show host dedicated a segment to the incident, calling it a teachable moment about belonging in America. A comedian on X posted a clip of the exchange with the caption, "Kennedy forgot Trevor's been here longer than some of y'all's Wi-Fi." The humor helped, but it didn't erase the sting. Trevor's team kept him updated, forwarding links and summaries, but he asked them to stop. "I don't need to read what people are saying," he told them. "I was there." Instead, he spent the afternoon in his office, scribbling notes for the next show, though his mind kept drifting back to Kennedy's words. Not the words themselves, they were old, familiar, the kind of thing he'd heard in different forms his whole life, but the intent behind them. What had made Kennedy say it? Was it a slip? A moment of frustration or something deeper? Trevor didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't angry, not in the way people might expect. He was curious, maybe even hopeful, that there was more to the story, something that could explain why a man like Kennedy would choose those words in that moment. Kennedy, too, was wrestling with his own questions. Clara's words had stuck with him, and as he sat in his hotel room that evening, the TV muted but flashing with news coverage of the incident, he started to see the moment through Trevor's eyes. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone, not really. He'd spoken from a place of instinct, a reflex born of a long day, a long career, a long life of saying what he felt, without always measuring the cost. But the cost was clear now in the headlines, in the comments, in the way his own team tiptoed around him. He thought about Trevor, about the way he'd kept his composure, the way he'd asked, "You really want to do this here?" There was strength in that, a kind of grace Kennedy hadn't fully appreciated in the moment. He picked up his phone, not to check the notifications, but to call his assistant. "Find out if Trevor's at the studio tomorrow," he said. "I need to talk to him. Just us." It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was a step. A recognition that words once spoken don't just vanish. They demand a response. And Kennedy was starting to understand that his would have to be more than a press release. The morning after the viral storm, the studio was quieter than usual, the usual bustle of crew members and pre-show prep muted by the weight of what had happened. Trevor Noah was in his office, a small space tucked away from the main stage, surrounded by scripts and a half-empty coffee mug. He was reviewing notes for the next show, but his mind wasn't fully on the pages. The memory of John Kennedy's words, "Go back to your country," still lingered not as a wound but as a puzzle. He'd spent his career turning tough moments into laughter, finding the human thread in every conflict. But this felt different. Kennedy wasn't a heckler or a troll. He was a respected senator, a man Trevor had admired for his straightforwardness, his ability to connect with people through plain talk. That's what made the moment sting, not the words themselves, but who they came from. Trevor leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had pushed Kennedy to say it. Was it a bad day? A deeper belief? Or just a misstep under the bright studio lights? He didn't have answers, and for once he wasn't sure he wanted to joke his way through it. Outside the studio, the city hummed along, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded on live television. John Kennedy arrived alone, no entourage, no press, just him in a plain jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, his phone tucked in his pocket. He'd called ahead, asking his assistant to arrange a meeting with Trevor. No cameras, no spectacle. Security at the studio entrance hesitated, recognizing him, but unsure of the protocol after the previous night's chaos. One guard raised an eyebrow, glancing at his colleague, but before they could decide what to do, Trevor's assistant appeared, nodding. "He's expecting him," she said, her voice professional but curious. Kennedy followed her through the back hallways, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the concrete floor. He felt out of place here, away from the Senate chambers and campaign trails where he knew the rules. This was Trevor's world, and Kennedy was stepping into it with no script, no prepared remarks, just a need to say something he hadn't figured out how to say yet. Trevor was waiting in a small meeting room near the stage, a plain space with a table, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the city. He stood when Kennedy walked in, his expression neutral, not warm, but not hostile either. Senator Trevor said, nodding, his voice steady but guarded. Kennedy took off his cap, running a hand through his gray hair, and sat down across from him. "Trevor," he said, his drawl softer than it had been on stage, "I appreciate you seeing me." There was no audience now, no lights, no applause, to fill the silence. Just two men, one a comedian who'd built a career on navigating tough conversations, the other a politician known for his candor, now facing the consequences of it. Kennedy didn't waste time. "I messed up last night," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. "I said something I shouldn't have, and I didn't realize how it landed until it was too late. I'm sorry." The words were simple, unpolished, not the kind of polished apology you'd hear in a press conference. Trevor leaned back, his arms crossed, studying Kennedy's face, looking for the weight behind the words. "Sorry's a start," Trevor said, his tone even but direct. "But I need to understand why you said it. You're not a guy who just says things by accident. What was going on?" Kennedy exhaled, his hands resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly as he gathered his thoughts. "I don't know if I have a good answer," he admitted. "It was a long day, a lot on my mind. And when you asked about where I was born, something just snapped. I didn't plan it. I didn't mean to hurt you. But I said it. And I own that." Trevor nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger but in curiosity. "Snapped?" he asked. "What does that mean? Because those words go back to your country. They're not just words. They carry history. They carry pain. You know that." Kennedy met his gaze, his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying a public life for decades. "I do," he said, "and I'm not here to make excuses. I've spent my life saying what I think, sometimes too fast. Last night, I let something out that didn't belong there. I don't believe you don't belong here, Trevor. I don't, but I said it, and I can't take it back." Trevor leaned forward, his hands now resting on the table, mirroring Kennedy's posture. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "I've heard that kind of thing before. Growing up in South Africa, I was the kid who didn't fit. Not black enough, not white enough, always on the outside. I came here, built a life, and still, sometimes I get reminded I'm not from here. But from you, that hit different. I respected you. I thought you saw people for who they are, not where they're from." The words weren't accusatory, but they were honest, raw, in a way that cut through the room's quiet. Kennedy nodded, his jaw tight, not out of defensiveness, but because he was listening, really listening. "You're right," he said. "I let you down. I let myself down. I've spent my career trying to speak for people, to be their voice. And last night, I spoke in a way that shut someone out. That's not who I want to be." The conversation shifted, moving away from the incident itself to something deeper. Trevor shared a story about his mother, about growing up in a place where belonging was never guaranteed, where every day was a negotiation with identity. Kennedy listened, his usual quick-witted responses replaced by a quiet focus. Then he shared his own story, not a biography, but a moment from his early days in Louisiana, when he'd misjudged someone spoken too quickly and learned the hard way that words have a way of sticking. "I was young," thought I knew everything he said, a faint smile breaking through. Took me years to learn that being right doesn't mean much if you're not kind. Trevor chuckled, the first real laugh of the meeting, and the tension in the room eased just a fraction. Kindness is hard when the cameras are on, Trevor said, but it's harder when they're off, and you still have to face yourself. They talked for nearly an hour, not about politics or headlines, but about the human side of their work, how public life amplifies every word, every mistake, and how it can make you forget the person on the other side of the conversation. Kennedy admitted he'd underestimated the platform, the way his words would ripple out beyond the studio. Trevor admitted he'd been caught off guard not by the words themselves, but by the source. "I thought we were cool," he said, half smiling. "I thought you got me." Kennedy nodded, his expression softer now. "I do get you," he said, "and I'm gonna do better to show it." It wasn't a grand promise, but it was real, and Trevor could see it in the way Kennedy's shoulders relaxed, the way his eyes didn't waver. Before they parted, Trevor stood extending a hand. Kennedy took it, but instead of a handshake, Trevor pulled him into a quick, genuine hug, not the kind you do for show, but the kind that says, "We're not done here, but we're moving forward." They stepped out of the room, walking side by side through the hallway, the same hallway that had felt so cold the night before. Trevor glanced at Kennedy, a spark of his usual mischief returning. "You know," he said, "you owe me a better interview next time." Kennedy laughed, a deep rolling sound that echoed off the walls. "Deal," he said, "but you're buying the coffee." They stepped out into the daylight. No cameras, no crowd, just two men who'd found a way to talk, to listen, to start rebuilding something that had cracked. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And in that quiet moment, it felt like enough. The studio was hushed, the usual pre-show energy replaced by a quiet anticipation that seemed to hum through the air. It wasn't the typical buzz of a live taping, but something heavier, more deliberate, as if everyone crew audience, even the techs in the control room, knew tonight was different. Trevor Noah and John Kennedy had agreed to step back onto the stage together, not for a full segment, not for ratings, but for a brief, unscripted moment before the scheduled rerun. No makeup artists hovered, no handlers whispered last-minute notes. It was just the two of them walking side by side through the backstage hallway, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. Trevor wore his usual sharp suit, but his expression was softer, less performative, carrying the weight of their earlier conversation. Kennedy, in a simple blazer, no tie, looked less like a senator and more like a man who'd come to say something that mattered. They didn't speak as they approached the stage, but there was a shared understanding in the silence, a sense that whatever happened next would carry the story forward, not erase it. The stage lights came up slowly, not the bright, welcoming glow of a typical show, but a softer hue, almost intimate. The audience, smaller than the night before, but still attentive, sat in their seats, phones tucked away, sensing this wasn't a moment for recording. Trevor stepped out first, his posture relaxed but purposeful, and the crowd clapped, a polite, warm sound that felt like a collective exhale. Kennedy followed, his hands in his pockets, his face calm but unguarded, a contrast to the steely confidence he'd shown the night of the incident. They didn't sit at the desk this time. Instead, they stood near the edge of the stage, side by side, facing the audience and the cameras. Trevor spoke first, his voice steady, his usual humor dialed back but still present in the cadence. "Hey, everybody," he said, a small smile breaking through. "This isn't our usual show. We're here for a quick moment, something we felt needed to happen before we move on. Last night, things got real, maybe too real, and we're here to talk about it." The audience leaned in their attention, locked, no laughter, no murmurs, just focus. Kennedy cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly, his hands now clasped in front of him. "Folks," he began his Louisiana drawl, soft but clear. "Last night I said something I shouldn't have. I told Trevor to go back to his country, and that was wrong. Not just because it hurt someone, but because it wasn't who I am or who I want to be." His voice didn't waver, but there was a weight to it, a sincerity that cut through the room. Trevor Noah is one of the most talented, thoughtful, and resilient people I've ever met. He's built something here, not just a show, but a way of talking to people, of making us laugh and think. I disrespected that, and I disrespected him. I'm here to own that and to say I'm sorry, not just to Trevor, but to anyone who heard those words and felt them the way they landed. The audience was silent, but it wasn't the stunned silence of the night before. It was the kind that comes when people feel something shift, when words carry truth instead of performance. Trevor glanced at Kennedy, his expression unreadable for a moment, then nodded a small gesture that spoke volumes. "Thank you, John," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's easy to break something in a moment. It's harder to stand up and fix it in front of people. That's what makes this matter." He turned to the audience, his hands spreading slightly, as if inviting them into the conversation. "Look, what happened last night wasn't just about me or John. It's about how we talk to each other, how we deal with differences, how we handle it when someone says something that cuts deep. I've been told I don't belong. Before plenty of times, different places, different ways. But what I've learned is that belonging isn't about where you're born. It's about what you build, what you contribute, how you show up. John and I talked today, really talked, and we found a way to move forward. Not by pretending it didn't happen, but by facing it." The crowd clapped, a slow, steady sound that grew not out of excitement, but respect. Kennedy nodded, picking up the thread. "I've spent my life speaking my mind," he said, "and I'm not gonna stop. But I learned something from this. Words aren't just words. They carry weight. They shape how people feel, how they see themselves. I didn't see that clearly until I saw the look in Trevor's eyes last night. I didn't mean to make anyone feel small, but I did, and that's on me. What I want to say to you all is this: if you mess up, own it. If you hurt someone, listen to them. And if you get a chance to make it right, take it. That's what I'm trying to do here." His voice was steady, but there was a humility in it, a quality that made the audience see him not as a senator, but as a man grappling with his own flaws. A few people in the crowd nodded, their faces soft, as if they recognized the effort it took to stand there and say it. Trevor stepped in, his tone lighter now, but still carrying purpose. "Here's the thing," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We're all gonna mess up. Me, John, you out there in the audience, everybody. What matters is what comes next. Do you double down? Do you hide? Or do you show up and try to make it better? John showed up today, not for a photo op, but to talk, to listen. That's not easy. And I hope what you take from this is that we don't have to agree on everything to respect each other. We don't have to come from the same place to build something together." He paused, letting the words settle, then turned to Kennedy. "You good?" he asked, his voice playful but warm. Kennedy chuckled, the first real laugh of the night. "I'm good," he said, clapping Trevor on the shoulder. "But you're still buying the coffee next time." The audience laughed, a gentle ripple that broke the tension, and for a moment, the room felt like it could breathe again. They didn't linger. Trevor wrapped it up with a simple, "Thanks for listening, folks. We'll see you tomorrow with the usual chaos." The lights dimmed, and they walked off stage together, not with the polished stride of performers, but the quiet ease of two people who'd found a way to share space again. The audience clapped as they left, not the wild applause of a comedy bit, but a steady, thoughtful sound that felt like acknowledgement. Backstage, the crew exchanged glances, some smiling, others nodding, as if they'd just witnessed something rare. The moment wasn't flashy, wasn't meant to go viral, but it was real, and that made it stick. The lesson wasn't lost on those who watched. Mistakes don't define you, how you respond to them does. Trevor and Kennedy had shown that in a world quick to judge, quick to divide, there's power in pausing, in listening, in choosing to rebuild. It wasn't about erasing what happened, but about showing that even a sharp divide can be bridged with honesty and effort. For the audience, especially the younger ones, it was a reminder. Words matter, but so does the courage to own them, to learn, to grow. It was a call to look beyond differences, to see the person behind the mistake, and to believe that even the toughest moments can lead to something better. As Trevor and Kennedy disappeared into the hallway, their silhouettes fading under the dim lights, the room held on to that calm, the kind that comes after a storm when the air feels clean and the path forward feels just a little clearer.